Hello, my friends. I had another great question this week, and that was the question about what is Q source and what are my thoughts on it, and what should we think about? How should we, deal with this idea of Q source? So let me start off by explaining for anyone who hasn't heard of what Q source is a little bit of Q source. So we know we have the synoptic gospel accounts and then the Gospel of John, which seems to be quite different, right? And then there's also the Gospel of Thomas, and then there's some other apocryphal gospels messages out there that all seem to be based around the same story, but they all have different details, right? We call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, meaning from the same viewpoint, because they're very similar, but there are differences there. And of course, Matthew has stuff that the other two don't, and it's missing stuff, right? There's all these kind of gaps there. And so, what some scholars have theorized is that there must have been a Q source, what they call Q source. There must be a single source that everyone was drawing off of. And so some scholars have taken it upon themselves to attempt to try to reconstruct this supposed Q source, which is the actual historical Jesus, is how you may have heard of this stuff talked about before. And there is some validity to this thought process, and there is some wild abuses, of course, of this as well. So let's talk a little bit about this single original source. Single original source. Was there a single original source? Probably, but probably not actually written down. Let me explain a little bit of that to you. Okay, first off, we know that the Gospels themselves were not written down until much later after the fact. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were most likely written somewhere a little bit after 60 AD. In fact, it's likely that Paul's letters were the earliest known writings within the early Christian community. John's Gospel most likely was written somewhere between 90 and 110 AD. And for reasons I'm not going to get into in this video, there is some strong indication that John's Gospel has the expectation that its readers already are familiar with the synoptic Gospels, and so John's Gospel functions more as a midrash or a commentary on the synoptic viewpoints. Not so much in that it's opinion, rather than it's filling in a lot of the details in terms of questions that have arisen about, well, why is this not answered in the gospel? Or that whole thing of eat my flesh and drink my blood. That really bothers me. And so John's gospel seeks to expound more on why that statement is being made. And so that would kind of make sense. But again, not something we're going to get into here. So if these gospels were not written down until 60 AD, doesn't that make them less reliable? Well, no, not at all. In that day and time, an original eyewitness account was considered much more reliable than a written record. We've got to realize that only about 10% of the population was literate. And to produce written documents was very expensive. Scholars estimate that Paul's letter to the Romans cost him around $4,000, $3,000 to $4,000 to produce. Can you imagine if you wanted to write a letter and it cost you $3,000 to $4,000? Yeah. Imagine how much time and thought process you'd put into it before you ever put pen to paper, and how much is this going to be copied? It cost a lot, and so most communities would be fortunate if they had one complete set of Torah scrolls. It was very expensive and very time-consuming to produce these things, and this is why you hear blessings for hearing the Torah, for hearing the book of Revelation, for hearing these things rather than for reading it, is because most people, their experience with the Torah, with the Gospels, was through hearing, was through going somewhere and hearing it spoken out loud. And since most people were illiterate, and because copies were very scarce, it would have been very easy for someone to make changes to a copy, and so it was considered less reliable. Now, an oral witness, and this is most, it was a very oral culture. Most information was disseminated orally. You would go and you would get your group of disciples. This is most likely what would have happened after Yeshua's death, resurrection, and ascension into the heavens, is that all of the disciples would have come together and they would have shared the story and they would have discussed things and tried to figure out things, and they would have come up with a narrative. Right? And they all have little bits and things. And here's one of the things is in eyewitness accounts. You know, sometimes scholars are like, well, see, it's not reliable because there are differences, there's conflicting reports between the three synoptic accounts. Actually, that lends to its credibility. If all three accounts agreed on every single little minor detail, then that would have shown that they all came from a single source. It's like when you line your kids up and you ask them what happened and all of them have the exact same story, you know something's wrong. You know that they got together and figured out a narrative beforehand. When there's conflicting reports, that leads to the veracity, or that lends to the veracity, the truthfulness of the report. They all get the major things right. They all line up on the major points, but the little minor details, those, it's perfectly understandable for those to be a little bit off, and that actually lends to the credibility of the report, and that's a good thing. So anyways, what most likely would have happened is they all got together and they all kind of came up with a single narrative upon which they could expound on or retract details from, that would then be taken out and reported to all the communities, because the whole point of the gospel message was that it was to go out to the whole world. And so if they didn't actually put pen to paper for another 30 years, how are they actually getting that information out? Most likely they didn't write a bunch of copies, because that's very, very expensive. Most likely what they're doing is they're coming up with a single narrative. These are the important things. These are the important things. That is what we could call Q source. Not a written source, but an agreed upon narrative of the most important parables, sayings, and events in Yeshua's life. Now, when the lifespan of the earliest witnesses, of the original witnesses, comes near to an end, now there's a need to actually record those witness accounts. And this is where you get the three gospels, the three synoptic gospels being recorded, is from these earliest eyewitnesses as they start to head towards their grave. They're getting old and they need to put pen to paper. Now, each of them is going to take this core story that was agreed upon of the most important things, i.e. Q source. Again, it's not something that we're ever going to find, I don't believe. They're going to take this Q source and they're going to expound upon it or remove details based on the needs of their audience. Matthew was writing to a certain community. Mark was writing to a certain community. Luke was writing to a certain community. Each of those communities has specific needs, and so the message needs to be tailored to them. It's like when I go out and teach, I will have the same overall message, all the same PowerPoint, but each community that I teach at is different. The way that I deliver the message is different based on the needs of that particular audience. And so this is where Q source comes from. This is this idea of Q source. Now, we do need to be very careful, because some scholars abuse the idea of Q source. They say, well, this gives us, this means that these people added on extra details that was not part of the original story. No, these were all eyewitnesses. They all saw these things. This is their memories. And the problem is that some scholars use this Q source in order to try to say, well, that was a made-up detail, without any sort of real evidence that this was made up, that this was a later addition. No, these were things that were actually recorded. It's just that these were extra details added by whichever disciple based on their own personal experiences with Yeshua, and not based on this bigger Q source, this agreed upon idea within the community. So I hope that helps you guys out, and keep the questions coming. Shalom.